Java Tutorial 4, we're writing our own methods. We'll start off with a really easy method that isn't receiving or returning any values, and then we'll keep writing a few more methods, each one getting a little bit more complicated. The first method that we'll write is public static void gets to mount doom. And as the name suggests, all this method is going to do is get Frodo to mount doom. Let's just print out gets to mount doom like a good, filthy little hobbit. So right now we have two methods inside of our class. We have the main method, which doesn't have anything in it, and then we have our second method, get to mount doom. And if we ran this right now, then get to mount doom wouldn't run at all, because when a Java program starts, then it just starts out at the opening brace of the main method, and then it runs anything in the main method up to the closing brace of the main method. So it wouldn't continue down here and run get to mount doom. If we want to run get to mount doom, then we have to put a call to get to mount doom inside of our main method, which just looks something like this. Get to mount doom with a set of parentheses. So if we run this right now, then the code will start at the start of the main method, and the only thing in the main method is the call to get to mount doom. When it gets to this call to get to mount doom, then it's just going to jump down here to get to mount doom, execute whatever is inside of get to mount doom, and then go back to whatever's next in the main method after the call to get to mount doom. Now let's write another method. Let's call this one kill orcs. And this one is going to be public static int, because we're going to send an integer value back to the main method from inside of this method that we're writing. So we'll call it kill orcs. And we'll just have it kill a random number of orcs somewhere between 1 and 100, and then we'll return that value back to the main method so that the main method knows how many orcs got killed. So we'll go int num orcs killed equals int, and a call to math.random, and we'll times that by 100 and go +1. So this will give us a random number between 1 and 100. And right now Eclipse is underlining our method name and saying that we have an error because we haven't returned an integer value yet. So it's saying, hey, you said you were going to return an integer value, but you haven't sent any integer value back to wherever this method got called from. So all we need to do is say return num orcs killed. And I'll just throw a C in there on the first line. I spelled orcs wrong. And the reason we would want to send this value back to the main method is so that the main method knows how many orcs got killed. If we didn't send it back, then in the main method, it wouldn't have access to this variable that we made called num orcs killed, because num orcs killed only exists inside of this method here, inside of our opening brace and our closing brace of kill orcs. Because after that, once the method's done executing, then it's out of scope. So that's why we want to send this value back to the main method. And in the main method, let's just store it in a variable. We'll say int num orcs killed equals kill orcs. And you don't have to name num orcs killed the exact same thing as it was named inside of your method. You can name it whatever you want. That variable name doesn't have to match up or anything. And let's put a little bit more inside of our main method. Let's just make a boolean is Frodo. And then just for fun, we'll say if is Frodo get to mount doom. And we'll set is Frodo to true so that he gets to mount doom. So when we run this right now, we'll get Frodo getting to mount doom and then a random number of orcs somewhere between 1 and 100 getting killed. We don't have any print statement for the number of orcs. Let's put that in. We'll go system.out.println num orcs killed plus orcs were killed. So now if we run it, then we'll get Frodo going to mount doom and then a random number of orcs getting killed. Next, let's send a value from our main method to a method that we write. And this is where things start to get a little bit more complicated, because what we can do with the value that we send to our method depends on whether that value is a primitive variable or an object reference variable. First, let's just write out the example and then I'll explain what I mean. Inside of our main method, let's just say boolean ring destroyed equals throw ring into mount doom. And this is the same way that we called our methods before, but the other times we had empty parentheses. This time we're going to put something inside of the parentheses, which will just pass that variable to the method that we're going to write. Let's just call it who has ring. and then whoever has the ring will try and throw it into Mount Doom. So we're passing our variable who has ring to our method throw ring into Mount Doom. And let's just make who has ring a string, and we'll give it a value of Frodo. And the reason we would want to pass a variable to the method that we're going to write is the same reason that we wanted to pass a variable back from the method that we wrote before. So this variable who has ring is only visible inside of our main method. So the method that we're writing isn't going to be able to see who has ring unless we actually pass it that variable who has ring. Now let's write our method throw ring into Mount Doom, public static boolean this time. And you're probably noticing a pattern. When we wanted to return an int, then we said public static int. This time we want to return a boolean value to store inside of our boolean inside of our main method, which is called a ring destroyed. So we just say public static boolean. And when we said public static void earlier, which is the same thing that main methods say, public static void, then that just says we're not going to return any value from the method. So the return type is void. Don't expect anything to come back from this method because nothing's going to come back. So we'll say public static boolean throw ring into Mount Doom. And then inside of our parentheses, we're going to tell this method what kind of variable it should be expecting. So it's going to expect a string variable, and the method can name this variable whatever we want. So it doesn't have to match up with the name of the variable that got sent to it or anything like that. We can name it whatever we want. I'll just make it match with the variable, so we'll call it who has ring again. And a really important thing to note here is that this method is actually going to make its own version of this variable. Just to make it extra clear, I'll call mine who has ring 2. So who has ring 2 is actually a different variable than the string that is getting passed to this method. And what Java does is it copies the value of the variable that's getting passed to the method, and it makes a new variable called who has ring 2, and it gives this variable the same value as the variable that got passed to the method. So we would say that we're passing the variable who has ring to our method, but really what we're doing is passing the value of the variable who has ring to our method. And then the method's making a new variable, and we get to choose what we want to name that variable. And just to showcase what happens when we pass variables to methods, let's also pass an integer and an array to this method. We might not use them inside of the method, but I just want to pass them to it. So we'll pass who has ring. We'll pass distance from Mount Doom, which will be an integer, and we'll have an array who's at Mount Doom. Who's at Mount Doom. So we'll just make these right above this call to throw ring into Mount Doom inside of the main method. Int distance from Mount Doom, and we'll just set that to 200. We'll say it's in meters. We'll have an array of strings called who's at Mount Doom. And let's just put Frodo, Gollum, and let's have Sam be there too. So we're passing 3 different variables to our method throw ring into Mount Doom. And this is where stuff gets kind of crazy because all 3 of these variables are going to behave differently inside of our method. So in Java, we have primitive variables. There are 8 kinds of primitive variables. We have bytes, shorts, ints, longs, floats, doubles, booleans, and chars. So these are our primitive variables. And what that means is just that Java stores the value of these variables different than it stores the value of any other variable in Java. For these primitive variables, what Java does, if you make, say, an integer named a, then Java will hop over into memory, name a little slot in memory a, and it'll store the actual value of the integer inside of that slot. So the value of a primitive variable is stored inside of the memory slot that gets the name of the variable. So when we made distance from Mount Doom, then Java took a little spot in memory, named that spot distance from Mount Doom, and stored the value 200 inside of that slot. But for anything other than primitive variables, then that's not how Java is going to store it in memory. For example, our string array or any other kind of array that Java makes, when it goes into memory, it's just going to name a slot, the name of the variable. So ours was who's at Mount Doom. And then instead of storing the actual value for this array inside of the memory slot, It's just going to store a little memory address inside of the memory slot. For our example, I'll call this memory address C6, and we'll just pretend that that's right over here in memory in slot C6. And in C6 is where Java would actually store whatever we put inside of that array. So I think we put Frodo, Gollum, and Sam. And for our string who has ring, Java would do the same thing. It would just come into memory, name the slot who has ring, and because strings are not primitive variables, then it wouldn't put the actual value inside of here. It would just put another memory address. Let's name this one C7, and then in C7 it would go put Frodo. So for a primitive variable, Java stored the actual value of the variable in the same memory slot that was named whatever we named to the variable. But for our other two variables, our array and our string, Java just stored memory addresses inside of those two slots that we named who's at Mount Doom and who has ring. And these other variables that aren't primitive variables, the name for them is object reference variables. You don't have to remember all these terms. It's a lot to take in at once. It's more the concept of it that's important to know for when you're passing variables to methods. But just for anyone who's curious, this area in memory over here is called the heap. And the heap is where Java stores objects. And that's why these other variables that aren't primitive variables are called object reference variables, because they just store the reference to the actual location of the object on the heap. So anything that isn't a primitive variable in Java is an object, and all objects get stored on the heap. And when we make variables for those objects, the variables don't actually hold the objects, they just hold a reference to that object. And the reference you can kind of think of like a remote control. So who's at Mount Doom is just like a remote control that points to the memory spot C6, which contains a string array. And the reason this is all important is because whether a variable is a primitive variable or an object reference variable changes whether or not we can change that variable inside of our method and have that change reflected outside of the method. So let's try and do that right now. Let's go inside of throw ring into Mount Doom, and let's try and change the distance of, what do we call it? Distance from Mount Doom, I think was what we called it. And we'll also need to tell this method that it's going to be expecting an integer and a string array. So we'll go int distance from Mount Doom, and our string who's at Mount Doom. And again, just to make it extra obvious that these variables are different from the variables that got passed into the method, let's just put a 2 onto the end of them. So distance from Mount Doom 2 and who's at Mount Doom 2. And I'll need to tell it that it's a string array that is coming in, not just a string for who's at Mount Doom. Now inside of our method, we can't change the value of distance from Mount Doom. We can change the value of distance from Mount Doom 2, because that is the variable that our method has, but our method throw ring into Mount Doom can't see this original variable, distance from Mount Doom. It only has access to the copy that it made, distance from Mount Doom 2, which starts with the same value that distance from Mount Doom had. So right now distance from Mount Doom 2 is 200. We could go ahead and change it to 300. Distance from Mount Doom 2 equals 300. So that's valid. Now our variable inside of our method has a value of 300 instead of 200. But if we tried changing distance from Mount Doom, which was the variable in our main method, then we can't do that because this method doesn't have access to that variable. For our string array, who's at Mount Doom, we actually will be able to change it inside of our method. If we change who's at Mount Doom 2, then who's at Mount Doom, our original one from the main method, is also going to get changed. When our method made who's at Mount Doom 2 here, and it got passed the value of who's at Mount Doom into that variable, the value that got passed from that variable was actually just the memory address. So if we go back into our little memory representation in here, who's at Mount Doom 2 was made, and into who's at Mount Doom 2 goes the value C6. And so who's at Mount Doom 2 is just pointing to the same object in memory as who's at Mount Doom. For our integer variable, distance from Mount Doom 2, it just got the value 200 passed into it. So when we went in and changed that value to 300, that change wasn't reflected in the variable that's inside of our main method. But for who's at Mount Doom 2, the value of this variable is just a memory address, And this memory address C6 points to the same memory address as that variable that was inside of our main method. So if we change who's at mount doom 2 inside of throw ring into mount doom, then Java's just going to say, okay, go and change the string array that's at memory address C6. So say instead of Frodo, Gollum, and Sam, we wanted to have Gandalf, Gollum, and Sam, then inside of our method, Java would say, okay, go to memory slot C6 and change the value of that object in there. And that object that's in there is the same object that was pointed to by the variable inside of our main method. So when we make that change inside of throw ring into mount doom, it's also going to be reflected inside of our main method. So if we change who's at mount doom to mount doom 2, and we'll just say change slot 1, I think it was, slot 0. Change who's at mount doom to 0 to Gandalf. And then I'll just return a value from this method just so that we can actually run it right now and see what's happening. I'll go return true because we're returning a Boolean value. And after our call to throw ring into mount doom, let's just print out who is at mount doom. And to print out who's at mount doom, I'm going to use this really convenient method. It's arrays.toString, and then you just pass it the name of the array, which was who's at mount doom, and that'll just print out the values inside of the array for us. So it's just a little bit easier than writing a for loop to print out all of these values. Right now we're just getting Gandalf, so I've done something wrong in here. Inside of the string array, I just made one string to pass into it. So I'll just put quotations for Frodo, Gollum, and Sam so that we have 3 individual items instead of just one massive string. So now we run this and we get Gandalf, Gollum, and Sam, which is what we want because inside of our method, we said change who's at mount doom to Gandalf, and so that change was reflected inside of the main method. But if we print out the value of distance from mount doom in our main method, then it wouldn't be 300 because that change wasn't reflected in the main method. So let's just print out distance from mount doom just to show that. Distance from mount doom. So the value is still going to be 200 because that's what the value was inside of our main method. And now the logical thing to think would be that we could change our string who has ring in the same way that we just changed who's at mount doom, because strings are objects, so we should be able to change it. But with strings, something really weird and specific happens. So we actually can't change the value of who has ring inside of our method. When Java makes the copy to send to the method, who has ring, then it will send that same value of C7 the same way that C6 got passed for our string array. But Java does this weird thing with strings where if you tell it to change a string, it actually just makes a new string at a new spot in memory. So if we tried to changing the value of who has ring to, then Java wouldn't go to C7 and change this value to whatever we want to change it to. It would actually just go to a new spot in memory. We'll say that's C8 for now, and it would make a new string here, say if Gollum has the ring now, and then it would just change that value of C7 to C8. This is something really weird and specific that Java only does with strings. With all other object reference variables, the same thing happens with our array, where you can actually change that variable inside of the method. Strings are the only object where this weird thing happens, where instead of changing the value of it, it just makes a brand new one and changes the location in memory that the string variable points to. So if we go inside of throw ring into mount doom, and we try changing who has ring to Gollum, and then we print that out inside of our main method, go who has ring plus who has ring, then Frodo is still going to have the ring inside of our main method. It won't actually change to Gollum. And one last thing I want to mention for writing your own methods, which isn't super important, is that often a lot of professors expect comments for every single one of your methods. And the format that usually takes, it's a little bit different for everyone, but the format it'll usually take is saying the method name, get to mount doom, maybe the purpose of the method, which is just get to mount doom, we'll say. Obviously, in an actual game, you would have more in here, it'd be more descriptive, but overall, you're going to want the method, the purpose, sometimes the date that it was written, and who wrote it. which, unless it's a group project, obviously is just going to be your name in there. And for anyone following along with the Java for Beginners playlist that I'm going to make, or the longer Java for Beginners tutorial video, then this is a new type of comment that we haven't seen yet. We've just seen the double slash comment, which is just a single line comment. And the comment here works exactly the same, just everything between the slash, star, and star slash is considered part of the comment. And these stars in here aren't really necessary. Eclipse just throws them in just to keep everything looking clean. So this type of comment is exactly the same. It's pretty much just used for multi-line comments, just so that if you're writing a comment that's like 10 lines, then you don't have to write slash slash at the start of every single line. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll put some links to some of my longer Java videos in the description, as well as to some awesome Java books to check out. Thanks for watching.